So next up, let's go ahead and implement our messages service. Now we will have to add some new API calls to our web service, and these will be actually the last API calls we need to add, and we need to implement the service itself so that it dispatches them. But in addition to that, we're also going to have to do something in our message activity, because I lock down messages that you can't see an image unless you are a person that has seen that or were sent that message. As a result, you won't be able to see images unless you send your your authentication token. So we're going to have to modify Picasso a little bit in order to facilitate that. It's actually not that difficult to do, and I'll show you guys how to do that here in a second. But first, let's start off with implementing our calls. Not a whole lot of them, actually. I'm going to create another section here, and I'm going to call this messages. Now the first one I'm going to do is send a message. Just like our sending of the avatar, it will be multi-part, and it's going to post to API v1 messages, and it's going to be void send message, and I'll break this out into multiple lines here. I think that'll look a little nicer. And we're going to have a part called message, which will be a typed string message. We'll have a part called to, which will be a typed string to. We'll have a part called photo, which will be a typed file photo, and then we'll have our callback, which will be callback, and then messages dot send message response. Callback. Next up, let's do our delete. So delete will be API v1 messages at ID, and it'll look like this. It'll be void delete message path ID int message ID, and then callback messages dot delete message response, and we'll call this callback. Next up, we'll do a put, and the put is going to be for checking the is read. So I'm going to say / API v1 messages at ID / is read, and we'll say void mark message as read with a path ID int message ID and a callback for messages dot mark message as read response callback. And then we need our search messages. I'm going to do 2 search messages. So I'm going to do, they're both going to hit the same API endpoint, but one is going to have a contact ID parameter and the other one isn't. So AP1 v1 messages void search messages, and we're going to use query strings for this. So I'm going to say query contact ID int from, and then we'll do another query parameter for include sent, boolean include sent, and then we'll have a query for include received, boolean include received, and then we'll have a callback for messages search message response callback. Now what I'm going to do, I'm just going to take this whole guy right here, and I'm going to copy and paste him. And the only difference is that I'm going to remove this from parameter. So we basically just have an overloaded function here, where one has the contact ID parameter and one doesn't. Then finally, the last API call we're going to need to implement is going to be a get of API v1 messages ID, and this gets a particular message details. So this will be called get message details, and it'll take a path with ID, int ID, and then a callback of messages.get message details response callback. All right, so now that I've done that, let's jump into our live messages service, and let's get this guy implemented. I'll hop over here if you guys want to take a pause on that for a second. But otherwise, I'll hop over back into the live message service, and we'll just implement those methods. This is going to be the simplest one of them all, actually. So we're going to subscribe to public void send message, messages send message request, and here we're going to say API.send message, and we're going to pass in a new typed string of request get message. So that's the message itself. A new typed string of integer.toString request.get recipient.get ID. That's our recipient. And a new typed file of image JPEG. And a new file of request.getImagePath.getPath. Then finally, we're going to do a new retrofit callback post, and I'm just going to take that, copy and paste that, or cut and paste that over there, and then pass in the bus, and we're good. that is all we need to do to send a message. Seems kind of anticlimactic, but it'll work. So next up, we want our search messages. This one will be slightly more complicated because we have two conditions here. So I'm going to do a search message request, and then I'm going to say if request.from contact ID equals -1, indicating that they don't want to search contact ID. I'm going to do API.search messages, passing in request. Or sorry, I'm going to do if not equals -1 because that would be the more positive thing for this if statement. So I'm going to pass in request.from contact ID, request.include receives or sent messages, and request.include sent messages, or include received messages. I'm really not a big fan of how this the ordering changes on the IntelliSense here. And then I'll pass in a new retrofit callback post, and I'll just cut and paste that. Next up, we have a an else condition here. I seem to have eaten a semicolon. We have an else condition here, which is just API.search messages, basically the same thing. Request, except we don't have the contact ID. So include sent messages, request include received messages, and new retrofit callback post, and we'll go ahead and do class bus. Okay, so next up, let's do our delete message. So public void delete message. So messages.delete message request. And then for here, I'm going to say API.delete message request.message ID new retrofit callback post. And I'll take this, I'll do class, and I'll do bus like before. And then I'll do another subscribe for our mark message as read. Messages.mark message as read request. And I'll do API.mark message as request, or as read request, message ID, new retrofit callback. And just take that and do class and bus. All right. And then finally, our last API call is going to be get message details, which will be messages.get message details request. And I'll do API.get message details request.id, and then new retrofit callback post. And we are almost done. What did I do there? Broke something. Let's go ahead and jump in here. Make sure that we have messages get message details response, messages get details response, service response. Oh, it's not that. It's that I passed an API instead of bus. Whoops. Okay. And that's it. So I'll go ahead and just scroll up slowly on this guy. But otherwise, I think we're really just about done with the API. So let's go ahead and hit play. Or no, whoops. Before we hit play, we have to implement the ability for us to send an authenticated request with our special student header and our auth token header to Picasso. Now, what I'm going to do this is I'm going to open up my Yura application. So I'm going to open up infrastructure Yura application, and I'm going to create a new, I'm going to create a Picasso here. And the Picasso instance, I'm going to configure to send these headers for me. So up here at the top, I'm going to write a private Picasso, and I'm going to call this auth Picasso. Seems like a silly name, but it was the best one I came up with. Then what I'm going to do is down here on my onCreate method, let's say after we implement our auth, what I'm going to do is I'm going to invoke a method that doesn't exist yet called create auth Picasso. And then I'm going to go ahead and write that method down here, create auth Picasso. And what this guy's going to do is we're going to create an OK HTTP client. And I'm going to call this client. And it'll be a new OK HTTP client. And then I'm going to say Picasso client dot interceptors dot add. And I'm going to pass in a new interceptor, just like what we did before. Remember how we added the interceptor in order to add in our headers before? Well, we have to do it again because we're not using retrofit to get our images. We're using Picasso. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say request. And I'm going to make sure I get it from OK HTTP. I'm going to say request new request equals chain.request.new builder. Then I'm going to say add header. And for this, I'm going to say authorization, which is going to be bearer plus get auth token. And then I'm going to add another header for x-student, which is going to be our student token. And then I'm just going to do .build. And then at the end of this method, I'm simply going to say return chain.proceed new request. So I just went ahead and modified the request by adding those headers in. And then I'll go ahead and close this off by creating that semicolon. And then I'll say auth Picasso equals new Picasso builder, passing in this for the context. And then I'm passing in for the downloader a new OK HTTP downloader, passing in our client that we built. And then I'll do .build. So that's all the code for that. The last thing we got to do here is, of course, I need to create a public Picasso get auth Picasso that returns my auth Picasso. And that's it. So now I can get the auth Picasso from the Euro application to get a Picasso instance that'll send across the appropriate headers. So make sure that you get the code implemented that you see on the screen right here. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump over into my activities and my message activity, and then scroll all the way up to where I had that to-do comment. This guy right here. So this to-do comment was inside of my show message, and this is where I need to actually go and load the message in, but load it using the auth Picasso. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say image view. Actually, I think I already aliased that out. I did not. So I'm going to say image view, image equals cast to image view, find view by ID, r.id, activity, message image. And then I'm going to say application.getAuthPicasso.load message get image URL into image. And that's it. So let's go ahead and hit run, and we should have a relatively fully functioning application. Now, there's still a couple things we don't have. We don't have our external logins built yet, and we don't have our push notifications built yet. We'll do our push notifications in the next video, and then we'll move on, or the next couple of videos, and we'll move on to our external logins. All right, check that out. We're both still logged in, which is really cool. So over there on this guy, I'm going to go ahead and enable my dummy webcam so that I can actually take an image that'll be sent to my other user over there. So I'm going to say select new image. I'm going to take this awesome picture here. I'm going to set a message of hello world. And I'm going to select choose recipient. And notice how my contact comes up. And I'll hit send. Well, wait a second. It might take a second for it to do. And check that out. So apparently we won the internet too. So it worked. I mean, insofar as it made the message, and it relaunched the message after the message was sent. And I can hit this translate button, I can actually see the thing that I sent the user. Now if I come over to inbox, I can pull down and do a refresh and check that out, received messages. And if I click on that, I get the message. So if I close this out and I hit reply over here, I should be able to take another image, already having Nelson 12 selected, hit send, come over here, refresh, and I get the message. Now, in addition to all of that, I should be able to come over here to my sent messages and see my sent message. And I should be able to come over here into contacts, click on the contact, and see that I sent a message to him and I received a message from him. So yeah. 13 minutes isn't really that bad for going from not having any sort of ability to send messages to wiring it all up. And that's, again, because we did all the work in our in-memory services. We did all the work in a very good testing environment where we can quickly iterate on our stuff. We can launch activities directly. Our code is very, very decoupled and pretty easy to deal with. And then when we needed the functionality to actually connect to the internet and send out these requests, it just works. So yeah, I guess in the next video, we'll go ahead and we'll start working on our push notifications so that we don't even have to refresh our inbox to receive a new image. So we'll see you guys in the next video.